Hello everyone, I'm Mike Connors, and welcome to How It Ticks, the go-to podcast for anyone with a spark of curiosity about the inner workings of Switzerland. Hosted by yours truly, an Australian expat with a deep curiosity, How It Ticks offers a platform where listeners are invited to explore the vast landscape of Swiss culture, business, innovation, and tradition. Each episode features a one-on-one interview with experts and thought leaders from various fields, providing a panoramic view of what makes Switzerland tick. If you are like me and you enjoy listening to successful people share their insights, this podcast is for you. My guest today is Laura Hackl, a leading expert in protein science, nutrition, and sustainability. Laura has a PhD in health sciences and technology from ETH, has worked as a research advisor for the USAID Advancing Nutrition and as a consultant for the International Atomic Energy Agency, where she designed studies to assess nutrient absorption and improve the quality of fortified meals. Her career spans global initiatives focusing on tackling food insecurity, enhancing diet quality, and driving innovation in nutrition and alternative proteins. What makes protein from animal sources so different from plant-based alternatives? Why is it important for alternative proteins to mimic the look, taste, and smell of meat? And given that many plant-based meat alternatives are highly processed, are we fully understanding their health and environmental impacts? In this episode, Laura and I dive into the science of protein, breaking down the differences between animal and plant-based proteins and exploring why alternative proteins are becoming increasingly important. We discuss her work at ProFillet, where she served as a nutrition specialist on a team developing a fish fillet substitute and the complexities involving mimicking meat using plants. We also touch on broader topics, including the gap in nutritional science and the disconnect between research and real-world applications, and the future of alternative proteins, from lab-grown meat to insect burgers. Now, here is my conversation with Laura Hackl. So Laura, how do you define what you do?
That is a great question. My trajectory is not super straightforward in that I'm a pharmacist by training, but I was always interested in the kind of global health space before I knew that this was a topic you could study, for example. So during my pharmacy studies, at the end of the studies, I started to look for other opportunities, which is how I landed in the kind of nutrition sciences where I did a PhD, and that was on nutrition science and food technology side of things. So this is where my passion lies, in trying to provide better nutrition to those who otherwise wouldn't have access, I would say.
So when you say things like global health, where specifically are you talking about?
I did some work in Ghana where I did a research study. I also did a study in India where I spent quite a bit of time to kind of set up the study infrastructure and recruit personnel and try to work with the kind of local collaborators to really set up the research facilities. And I also did some work with USAID Advanced Nutrition that was mainly in East Africa. So I traveled to Kenya and Tanzania.
If we take one of these places as an example, say Ghana, at the end of an experience like that, how does your view on what it takes to really do good research change from when you started to when you finished?
Well, it changed a lot, specifically in Ghana, because that was the first time I actually did research in a, let's say, resource-limited setting. So basically, my area of work was in food fortification, and it just means that you add nutrients to a specific food. In my case, it was rice, and that was what my whole research was about. So basically, what we had done in Switzerland was to prepare the rice, add some sauce so that it would be palatable, and then participants would eat it. But apparently in Ghana, it's not so much in their culture that you would already mix the rice and the sauce. So they would have to mix it themselves. But it was school-age children, and we had quite small bowls. And the kind of tricky part when you work with stable isotopes, it's a really precise method. So you cannot lose any food because it would basically make all the results invalid. So we needed to make sure that, you don't lose a kernel of rice from the portion. And my first response was like, no, we can't do that. It's not possible. And we made it work with great support. But this also, showed me in a way that being culturally sensitive and making sure that you listen to those who actually know better is really important.
When you are fortifying rice and you're giving it to different groups of people to measure the outcome, how are you measuring the outcome? What does the result look like?
So basically, you give the food with the stable isotope that's completely safe. And then 2 weeks later, you draw blood. And then you compare the composition of the isotopes in the blood before and after. So, for example, your composition of iron isotopes in the blood is the same as basically everyone else's, but someone who participated in the study has a slightly different composition. And this, because iron is recycled so well in the body, this is kind of valid for a long time.
And so you do these tests in very particular amounts so that you can't waste a single grain of rice, and so it's very measured. How does that translate though into the real world? They're not going to be eating rice in a very controlled environment. So how does research like this translate to real world application?
Yes, that's a great question. I think in this area of research, it's, I think, more applied than in other areas. Of course, it's never gonna be, they will never consume the food like they do in a research environment. That is clear. So what we make sure is when we give the rice, for example, is that we give it without too many what we call anti-nutrients. So there are, especially in a lot of plant-based foods, there are anti-nutrients that would actually prevent the iron from being absorbed in the body. And this is basically a big issue, especially in low resource settings where they eat a lot of legumes and other plant-based sources that have a high amount of anti-nutrients. In terms of this type of research with the rice, the idea is to just understand whether this improves the iron absorption. In this case, the sample size, so basically the number of participants was very little. Because it's so precise, we can afford having a very low number. There are other types of studies where you would require a higher number.
Now, I wanted to ask you about anti-nutrients. I hadn't heard this term before, but I guess if there are anti-nutrients in specific foods, that would mean that, say, we have two hypothetical types of food. They both have the same measure of a particular level of iron or whatever it is that we're measuring, but one of them has anti-nutrients. Does that mean that one of them, the bioavailability is greater than the other one, and therefore one of them will get more of that nutrient than the other one because of this additional factor?
So if there are anti-nutrients present, then you would have a lower absorption. So you would receive less iron that's bioavailable to you.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, for example, if you have some sort of porridge that has a lot of the anti-nutrient, one of the most prevalent ones is phytic acid. And that's basically really the the biggest contender when it comes to anti-nutrients. If you, for example, soak it overnight, then the phytic acid degrades. So therefore, you could, by just soaking it overnight, you could remove some of the phytic acid. But the issue is, like you can do a lot of research on that. And I mean, there's a ton of research that has been done on this topic and on phytic acid in general. But the issue is always to not just have it published somewhere in a fancy journal, but to actually bring this information to the people and then to have them actually change maybe their way of preparing those things. So there's often this discrepancy between what we know and what's evidence and, like what has been proven, but then also how do we make sure that it reaches those populations who could benefit from it, and how can we help them to maybe have some small changes to their behaviors that would probably create a very positive impact on them.
When you said porridge, it got me thinking as an example. One thing I was really looking at, and I wasted a whole probably Saturday trying to figure this out, was whether oats are good or bad. Because on the packet it says it's great, but if you start reading research, some say good, some say bad, all have their list of reasons. And this really seems to be for everything, especially when it comes to meat. Why do you think that it is so complicated to say whether things are generally good or bad?
That's a great question. I think there are different reasons. One is that everyone reacts differently. There are a lot of people who say, okay, they can't have gluten for some reason or another. Some of those are actually celiac, so they actually get sick from eating anything that contains gluten, and that can be very severe, even if there are small traces in it. And then, some people, they may not have a kind of a clinical diagnosis of celiac disease, but they still don't support it so well, or they don't like it, or, there may be other reasons. And then I think there's often this kind of imbalance between personal beliefs, proven research, and in a way, opinions. When it comes, for example, to ultra-processed foods that have been in the media a lot, there's a lot of, in a way, demonization happening when it comes to ultra-processed foods. But then when you look into the actual research, it's often not so straightforward, because my understanding is that it really depends on the type of ultra-processed food, and there's just not a lot of research on the different kinds. So if you say you have ultra-processed red meat, I think there is quite some evidence showing that it's not so healthy. But if you have, for example, whole grain bread that has been ultra-processed, I don't think there is much evidence that it is harmful. And again, it also depends on, how much of a specific food you would consume.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think your question is very much to the point, but then it's also equally difficult to answer. There's a lot of things we don't know. And I often find it problematic that there's often a kind of shyness to admit that we don't know certain things, and there's more research needed. Because if there would be one perfect answer of what you should eat, I'm sure many people would love to just eat the right thing all the time. But there is this, let's say, medical side to it. There's the personal side. And then there's also culture, right? There is a big cultural component in, I remember when I came to Switzerland, we had a fondue, and it was organized by my lab, and I suggested to bring a salad, and people almost got offended. But for me, I wasn't really familiar with the concept of fondue, and
A kilo of
I thought,
cheese and bread. Yeah.
yeah. So I think it's, you know, it's something that sounds funny, but it is so important to consider what's in your culture. My partner is American, and I always thought that I knew a lot about American stereotypes, just because I was exposed to a lot of media, and uh, it's just a very, in a way, prevalent culture. But then you learn kind of small things, and understand that we are all very different, and where we come from really defines us, and maybe defines also what we like and not like, or what we can or cannot uh, support physically.
That's true, and we also have cognitive dissonance. So when you have been doing something your whole life, eating, say you've been drinking milk your whole life and you love it, and then one day you get told, "No, this is actually really bad for you." There's that physical uncomfortable feeling that you get when you've been told something different to your belief, and it's very easy to, I guess, ignore it, especially when it seems the evidence never seems to be conclusive, I guess, when it comes to nutrition anyway.
Yes, and I mean that's definitely because if you look at the studies, like you have different study designs, right? So if you have an epidemiological study, um, you have just big amounts of data, and then you try to find some associations between one big data source, and cross-referencing with uh, other pieces of evidence from the same pool. But then there's a lot of information that you don't have, right? So if you have a big cohort, um, and you find that consumption of red meat is associated with heart disease, there are probably still a lot of people who consume that red meat and don't have anything. But you don't have the granularity of the data to understand what did they do differently than their peers.
I was reading into red meat, and it seems extremely complicated because there's all these other factors which aren't necessarily measured with the research. And I think red meat was something along the lines of, if you are a large consumer of red meat versus someone who's vegetarian, the chances of you having poor dietary choices outside of red meat are much higher than if you're consciously already a vegetarian anyway. So there's other things where you probably eat worse food outside of that particular study. What a mess to have to have findings on.
Yes, and that's definitely like a shortcoming of research, and also maybe something that could be improved going forward, because nowadays it's much easier, I think, to collect more data, and to maybe provide more context for better or for worse. You can track a lot that you weren't able to. One example, especially when it comes to nutrition research, is dietary recalls. So this is basically one of the cornerstones of nutrition research, is asking participants what they ate.
Mm.
And there are different ways to do it. You can do a 24-hour recall where you ask, okay, what did you eat in the last 24 hours? And then, like I could tell you I had cereal in the morning, and then for lunch I had a salad, and then I had a cake and something. And then as a researcher, you would ask, okay, anything else? Like, can we go over it again? And then like you would basically reiterate, just to make sure that you captured everything. That is in a way something that's somewhat accurate, but it really, really, really depends on who is the participant. Well, did they forget something? Did they, eat an additional cake but were embarrassed, so they don't want to tell you? Was there something special? Did they eat the whole portion? Did they finish it? If you ask, if you make pasta, for example, one portion for you may look different than one portion for me. So there's so much conscious and unconscious bias in this type of research. So now, with things being more digital and there are definitely, I would say, better ways or more accurate ways maybe to track. But most of the tools I think are not there yet, because there are some tools, where you can take a picture and then it tells you what food is in the picture, what's the composition. But I think those tools are not yet granular enough to actually track everything.
And as you're talking about what's required to gather the data from people about what they're eating, and I think if you are doing a study on the correlation between heart disease and processed red meat, I would imagine that that's a really long study. That's not a week. That's months and months or years if you want to actually detect a correlation. So would you have to do this for really, really long periods of time?
It really depends on what your research question is. And then depending on what you want to find, you have to calculate the sample size. So you would look into what is the outcome you're measuring and what is the kind of effect that you're anticipating, which you would probably use some prior data that are, close enough or closest enough to what you're measuring. And then you have a certain number, and then you would probably account for some attrition, which would depend on, again, what you're exactly measuring. Because if you have, what in the studies that I did on iron absorption, it was a relatively simple protocol, but people had to come back every other week for 6 weeks. And that's kind of, or for 8 weeks even, that's kind of difficult to do, just because, I don't know, maybe in 6 weeks, I'm sick or I have a test and I can't come. And then I had another study on zinc absorption, where in addition to having to come every other week, they also had to bring in a urine sample, I think, every 6 times on different days. So it's just like a lot of logistics, which, then it also is convenient if you have, for example, students being your participants, because they have to go to university. They have a relatively fixed schedule and can probably accommodate. But then again, you have a student population, and that may not be generalizable to, other people even at the same age.
And from your experience, how does the bias of the particular researcher or research group play into this? Because I can imagine if you are doing a study, there would be a hope to find it lean one way over the other way, because this leads to more money, or this leads to a better headline and therefore more career progression. Do you think, I've read this before, but I'd be curious as a researcher to get your take on that.
So I don't think any of these biases are malintended. I believe that as a researcher, you are aware that you have a responsibility to generate knowledge and generate knowledge in the best and most accurate way possible. However, there is maybe some sort of disconnect in what can or cannot get funded. So if you work in research, and depending on how your work in your contract is set up, you would have to get funding to do certain types of work. And the funding can, be from the government, or from industry, or from different different places. And then it really depends on what is of interest to whoever funds your study. So if you have a really great idea and you think it's really important, but the funding body does not agree, then you won't get the money, then you cannot do it. So in a way, it's often an in between what would be really interesting from a scientific point of view, to further the knowledge, cross-referenced with what the funding agency considers as relevant. Because, in a way, only because it's interesting scientifically also doesn't mean that it would have the most impact on individuals. There's a lot of interest in sustainability research, for example, and especially in this area, the research funding is limited. So, you could, for example, study the behavior of polar bears in different temperatures, or you could study the behavior of birds in the tropical forest. So it's just, there's so many different questions that would be important and relevant, but I think there's just not enough resources to answer them all. So someone has to prioritize and make a decision. And that often means that some research that you as a researcher find most pressing is not getting addressed.
I know one of the areas of particular interest for you is alternative protein sources. And I also know that you have been involved in XPrize Feed the Next Billion. Can you explain to me what that is exactly and what your role was?
Yes, sure. So XPrize Feed the Next Billion was a competition, and the goal was to create either alternative chicken or alternative seafood that matches the kind of animal origin in terms of sensory aspects and nutritional composition. And together with my colleagues from our startup ProFillet, we made it to the finals.
You're essentially saying, for people here in Switzerland, something similar to, say, planted chicken. So something that looks and feels, or in your case, fish, but something looks and feels like meat, but is actually plant-based.
Yes, and I think the biggest challenge that we, and I think also other teams, faced was that the nutritional composition had to be basically matching the animal origin, which, for example, in the case of protein, is very difficult to do, because the more protein you try to add to a plant-based alternative, it makes the product quite dry. So balancing the nutritional and sensory aspect is very difficult.
Why does it need to be nutritionally the same? I mean, could you make it nutritionally different but better? Because I would imagine that for fish or chicken, they're very healthy for you in general, but I'm sure they're not perfect.
Yes, I mean, ideally, if you could make it better, that would be preferred. But it is already really difficult to meet the nutritional aspect. So I think at this moment, there are very few to no products that meet the protein content of their conventional counterparts.
So the most difficult part then is actually the protein, not the texture, not the flavor, not the other things. Actually, the protein count is the most challenging thing.
It's all of the above. So you have this cogwheel where everything has to feed into each other. And this is really difficult. So let's say if you prioritize the sensory aspects, so taste and texture, you can do it, but then probably the protein would have to be lower. If you prioritize the protein, then you have to be quite creative to get the taste and texture right. And this is something that we are still working on fine tuning. I think we got very far, especially, we have a lot of different samples from different generations that we've created along the journey. And you tell that, in the beginning, it didn't taste great or the texture wasn't great. And now we're trying to fine tune it so that all of the different aspects are met. But that, also shows how difficult it is to create something that is good enough to actually tell it as a product.
So this would be a cooked fillet of fish. That's what you're trying to achieve with plants.
Yes, exactly.
What are the ingredients in a plant-based piece of fish? That's really interesting.
Well, I can't tell you the exact composition because that's proprietary information. But basically, what a lot of those products contain is different types of protein components, such as pea flour or soy flour, that are very high in protein. And then, of course, also other binders and stabilizers.
This goes into your previous comment around ultra-processed foods, but my first thought that comes to mind often, actually, when I see plant-based foods is it really good for you if you've got really processed foods, which by themselves taste and feel nothing like the product in which they're being engineered to taste like? Is there a risk that no matter how close it is in the lab, that it isn't the same level of nutrition and health?
I think it really depends. And it's, again, there's a lot of things we don't know. Is it healthy or not? It's probably healthier than eating a burger and fries every day. Is it healthier than eating a salad? No, probably not. But it really depends. And there is this notion that there is one way to eat or one diet that's right or wrong. I don't think that's the case. I think it's way more nuanced. Obviously, you shouldn't eat like sugary foods all the time. I think this is something we can agree on. Yet still a lot of people eat sugary foods all the time. And in a way, eating it once in a while is probably okay if you don't overdo it. And then in addition to physical health, there's also sustainability aspect. So if you say, okay, you don't want to eat meat for whatever reason, including ethical reasons or cultural reasons or sustainability reasons, what is, like, how can you replace that with something else? And in that case, an alternative protein food is probably better than not replacing the protein at all, So I think that's a little bit depending on where you stand. The answer is, I think, not that straightforward,
Not so clear.
unfortunately.
Is there a reason that it's important to have plant-based alternative protein sources to look and feel like meat? Is that because there's an acceptance that people are never going to switch from a meat patty to a veggie patty? The only chance we're going to roll this out successfully is if you can essentially convince them that the veggie patty is meat.
So I think there's a lot of behavioral research that still needs to be done on this. I can only tell you anecdotally from myself. So I've been vegetarian, I think, for about 25 years. I still would like to have meat. If it were like, I don't want to eat animals just for my own personal beliefs. I still think it tastes good. And if you give me an alternative that's as close to meat as possible, I would prefer that over quinoa patty that doesn't resemble meat at all. I know from other people who've been vegetarian or vegan for a long time, or it depends. They don't like that it resembles meat. And I have a friend. He's from India. He was never he grew up vegetarian. For him, resembling meat doesn't really make sense. So he doesn't need that. I think it really differs. For me, I would totally go for as close as possible.
It's also difficult, and you'll tell me if this is right or wrong, but my understanding also is protein is less bioavailable in plant-based foods compared to meat, which means that 100 grams of protein that's plant-based is not necessarily equal to 100 grams of protein meat-based. So overall, it is more difficult to hit those goals if you're vegetarian. Do you find that to be true?
There is definitely a concern when it comes to the protein quality. So for protein quantity, I think most general populations in most parts of the world, in general populations, there is often no lack of protein in terms of quantity. But the quality of protein, so the composition of the different amino acids, that is very much an issue. So if you have a predominantly plant-based diet, it is likely that there are some amino acids that you're lacking. There is, for example, if you take soy has a very high protein quality, similar to what animal-based foods have. And there are certain food groups in the kind of plant-based foods that are limited. So, for example, if you have nuts, they may be missing a certain amino acid. If you have grains, they may be missing a certain amino acid. So what's important is to combine plant sources to actually reach the right amino acid profile and therefore protein quality.
Okay, so if we take nuts and grains, for example, they might individually be missing certain amino acids, but not necessarily the same amino acids. So if you sort of eat them
Correct.
together, okay, I see.
Yeah. So I mean the amino acids that are often kind of the main contenders are lysine and methionine that are basically creating this limitation. So it's a little bit a bit tricky.
Demands a bit of nutritional education, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've been in this nutrition space for quite a long time. I don't know how many years, but more than a decade. And it's still difficult to navigate. And I know from other colleagues too, who are like, well, I know a lot about, iron or zinc or whatever, carbohydrates, but no one knows the whole picture because it's just so complex.
I wanted to ask you your take on a couple of alternative protein sources we haven't talked about so far, which are not plant-based. Have you put any time or effort into understanding the potential value in insects as an alternative protein source?
Yes, I think it's definitely a very interesting topic. I think also from a sustainability point of view, I think one concern that I've heard about recently, and I think there is research being done, is also on the well-being of the insects and whether farming insects like you would farm pigs, like is that ethically something that one can support. So I think there will be more research coming up in this area. But I do think from a sustainability perspective, it's probably one solution that will gain more traction in the years to come.
I was thinking about this where a consideration for being vegetarian is that you don't want to eat animals because they have their own personality, and the more like the animal a human is, the more you can see a human traits in an animal, the more you connect with them. So generally speaking, bigger animals, more intelligent animals, cows, pigs, you think, okay. The other argument you could make is I'm better off eating cows than insects because one cow serves a lot more people than insects. So you can go to a restaurant and order shrimp and you essentially taken 25 lives to eat your meal as opposed to 1/50th of one. And I was thinking about that. How do you decide what ethically is valuable in terms of a life when consuming food?
Yes, and also to me, this is like one very big question because in a way, especially when it comes to low resource settings, I would always eat less animal products, eat less meat, eat less eggs, etc. When it comes to low resource settings, the equation is a bit different, right? Because there are many individuals who have severe nutrition deficiencies that may be very hard to meet with a just plant-based diet. So how can we justify telling those individuals that they shouldn't eat animal products? And those are not very easy questions to answer, for sure.
Have you spent any time learning about lab-grown meat? I remember being really interested in this, but must have been 5 or 6 years ago, and it seemed very promising, but I haven't heard about it for a while. And in theory, it seems like almost a perfect solution if you can grow in a lab actual red meat at a reasonable price at scale.
Yes, I mean, I went to Singapore in 2023, I think, and I actually tried cell-based meat, and yeah, it tasted quite good. And for me, for someone who actually likes meat, I was very excited that this would gain traction. I think, there are some issues that are not yet completely resolved. It's quite expensive in, that it's not yet scalable. I think this is something that probably can be overcome in the next decade or so. And then in terms of regulations, it really depends on the country. I think Europe at some point changed it so that you could produce it for research reasons. So I think it's definitely a space to watch. I think given, that we have a growing global population, that we will need to feed this population, I think it's one of the ways to go. It's one pillar that will be important going forward, just because the answer to feed the growing population will not be to farm more animals, or at least this will be limited. For me, I'm very excited about this. Does it have some disadvantages in terms of nutrition health? Maybe. We don't know. We would have to see. But I think it's definitely something that is a very exciting field. But for now, it's just not so scalable. It's quite expensive. You need different media to actually prepare it. I'm not a biochemist, so I don't know all the details of it, but it's not yet easy, but I think it will be in the future.
Yeah, there's also a argument against it. I mean, one reason to be vegetarian over having meat is for environmental reasons because of the energy cost to raise animals. And I think the energy costs to do lab grown meat at scale is at this point in time huge. So there's a few hurdles they need to jump over, I suppose. But I guess in principle, it is something which, if they could manage it at scale, would solve a lot of problems.
Yes, I agree with that. And one issue that I'm always a bit critical about as well is if you read any paper, there's always this sustainability part that's being highlighted. And when it comes to plant-based meat or plant-based milk or whatever, it's like, yeah, it's so much more sustainable. But then if you actually look at how sustainability is quantified or like how it is measured, there are very few assessments of sustainability of plant-based products.
Interesting.
And one reason is because it's very difficult to do, and it costs money, it costs resources. And there's also some questions in terms of IP, because if you would do a thorough assessment of the sustainability, then you would have to disclose some of the processes that you're applying to produce the product.
This probably goes into what we talked about earlier in terms of the study versus the practical reality and how there can be a difference between the two.
Yes, I mean, there are different aspects to it. One is it costs a lot of energy and money to do it. But then there's also, do you want to know something that's actually bad for you or your company or like that would give your product a better reputation? Probably not. For example, what we had to do for the XPrize competition was to do actually a life cycle assessment and to do a cost comparison. So that's why, we realized this is a lot of work. It kind of takes a lot of resources, but we had to do it. So that's why we did it. And it turned out that the product would be more sustainable at a certain scale. But then every product would have to do a similar assessment. So if you have a lot of products, or, if you're a big company and you have a lot of products, it's very expensive to do it. If you're a very small company, you may also be just restrained by the resources you have. And then again, if you do this kind of testing, you have to disclose everything from your production process. So that's why it may not be so attractive to do it, because if you're a company, who pays for this? Like, you have to pay for it yourself, but does it lead to more customers purchasing your product? Does it lead to you having a better reputation? Or, does it maybe harm your reputation if the outcome is not as good? So I think there's definitely a lot more to do. I'm wondering how to best incentivize companies to actually do this work, because it's very important. We can say, yes, it's more sustainable, but then if we don't know how much more, it's also a bit of
It's a hard selling point if you don't have all the answers.
Yeah. And then similar, what we talked about earlier about the protein quality. If you say, soy products have equal protein quality to animal products, that's great. But then does the process that you kind of have the product undergo, does it change the protein quality? If you use a flour versus a concentrate, like, are there any differences when it comes to protein quality in the end product? I think these are also questions that are still not fully answered, and hopefully they will be in the future.
Now, as a closing question for you, are you optimistic about the trajectory that alternative and plant-based protein is on at the moment? Do you see good progress over the next 10 years?
I'm optimistic. I try to be. there's definitely, a few years ago, I think, let's say 5 years ago, there was a lot of interest in the alternative protein space, and there was a lot of funding available as well. And now it seems to have slowed down, and I think that the investment has declined. I think it will come back. I think it may not be as easy to start something fresh and to get funding for a new idea. But I think there may be fewer ideas, but hopefully better ones that will be able to survive. So I am hopeful. I know I told you I've been vegetarian for more than 25 years. That, like, when I think of 10 years ago, soy milk was not very good. When I think of 20 years ago, it was awful. Now there are so many good and great options, and also options that have been around for a few years already. So I am hopeful, that there will be good products. There will be good products that will survive. And then, there will be maybe products that won't make it because they don't meet certain criteria that they would need to succeed. But I try to be hopeful.
Okay, that's good. Well, Laura, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, the pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much. And yeah, I hope
If people want to contact you, what is the best way to do so?
Yes, please. Definitely, if they want to contact me, reach out. I think you have my email address in LinkedIn. So if you want to put those in the show notes,
Sure.
yeah, that would be. I'm always happy to chat and also get some feedback and learn more about others' opinions. So
and share stories about your cats as well. It sounds like.
Absolutely, and board games.
And board games. All right, Laura. Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Thanks a lot. You as well. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. If you did enjoy the episode and you want to support me, it would mean a lot if you could rate the episode and follow the podcast on your favorite platform. It really helps the show grow and reach more people. I'll see you in the next episode.